spans across Canada, and we're members of the Revolutionary Communist International. We are internationalists. We believe that capitalism is in crisis internationally and needs to be overthrown internationally. So we're here today to talk about the never-ending wars in the Middle East. As you all know, big things happening as per usual. I think there was a moment there where we thought maybe we were coming to an end with the never-ending wars in the Middle East. I think we were kind of on the same page. Trump promised to pull out of the never-ending wars, and here we are again on the brink of a war across the whole region that will potentially pull in the world's superpowers, right? This is kind of a big deal. So as communists, it is our task not to weep, not to laugh, but to understand. So Marco is has the big task of starting that off for us. He's gonna present the situation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. And I really encourage everyone to participate in that discussion. Bring in your comments, your questions, your thoughts, your disagreements, and we'll take it from there. So I'll let Marco start, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Penise, and thank you everyone who's come out today and everybody watching at home. I want to start with a quote. It's a quote from the Roman historian Tacitus, although it wasn't actually his quote, but it was a quote that he noted down from one of the enemies of Rome at the time. And what that individual said was, to ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles, they call that empire. And where they make a desert, they call it peace. Now I think there's a pretty profound idea here. Essentially, that when any nation goes to war, it always presents its aims in very noble terms. This is a war for peace, this is a war for human rights, and so on and so forth. But when we actually look at what they're doing, what it really is nothing else but barbarism. And the reason I invoke that, obviously this was from Roman times, but I think it applies entirely to the situation that we're seeing in the Middle East today. Just to recap where we are, I'm sure everyone here has been following the situation closely. But on July 13th, Israel launched an unprovoked attack on Iran. The last count that I saw had just north of 600 people dead inside of Iran. A significant number of those people are civilians. A significant number are women and children. They say they're not, or they're not hitting civilian infrastructure, that they're only targeting military infrastructure. This is a complete and total lie. Just a few days ago, they launched a missile at the public broadcaster in Iran. It's mostly civilians that work at that facility. And at any given time, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people who would have been working in that facility. So no, they are targeting civilians, or they're targeting military infrastructure, but they don't care who they kill when they send in these missiles. The United States knew about this attack in advance. This has now been established. It's also been established that the United States provided intelligence to Israel in the lead up to this attack and to allow them to facilitate this attack. And they've continued to support Israel throughout its bombardment over the past week. I would also add, It's not just the United States that has taken this position, but all of the major Western imperialist powers, which have effectively made excuses for Israel in this situation. That includes all of the major European leaders, and that includes our own esteemed Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who just a week ago issued a statement after the attack calling for de-escalation in the region. They always like to use that word, de-escalation. And then, of course, asserting that Israel had a right to defend itself. Now, let's think about this for a minute. They're calling for de-escalation when it's their ally that's escalating the situation and bombing another country unprovoked. They also talk about Israel's right to defend itself, when at that point in time, it was Iran being attacked, not Israel. It was Iran being attacked. You know, it's a bit like, to use an analogy, if you have two kids on the playground, and one of the kids viciously beats the other within an inch of his life, and then, you know, the mother comes in, and then instead of lecturing the assaulter, lectures the kid who's been beaten up and say, hey, listen, he has a right to defend himself. This is essentially what's happening here in this situation. It's utter and total hypocrisy. Iran obviously retaliated, which I would also add is its right under international law even to respond. You know, they talk about Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, I would say also Iran has a right to defend itself, doesn't it? It doesn't just apply to Israel. Iran also has a right to defend itself. Let's not forget that. And we've had a number of people killed, obviously, in Israel, which obviously we don't celebrate that, but these are the facts. Trump has most recently said that he's going to take 2 weeks to consider whether or not the United States will enter the war. Now, we'll discuss this in a bit, but I think this is an open question at this point in time. Although, just to say, if the United States were to enter this war, it would represent a massive escalation of the current conflict. And you have the possibility for a war in the region, the likes of which we haven't seen arguably in a generation. You know, what you saw in Syria, what you saw in Lebanon, will look like child's play compared to what could happen in Iran, which is a major country with a significant population, significant military at its disposal. So we have a bloodbath potentially being prepared. Anyway, I'm not going to recount all the facts and figures because I'm sure you're following it yourself. But the reason why we're here today, the question is, why is this happening? We need to, yes, like Penny said, understand why this is going on. You know, you have some people who say, you know, with good reason, you know, all of these people are just insane. You know, Trump, Netanyahu, these people have lost their minds. They're crazy to go to war with Iran. There might be an element to that. I think, yeah, Netanyahu in particular, I think you could say, has a few screws loose. I don't think that's an exaggeration. However, I don't think that's sufficient to explain what's happening in the region. From a Marxist standpoint, when we analyze the question of war, there are always deeper causes that lie behind every single war. There are always interests involved in every single war, and it's our task to identify those interests, find the thread, and through that gain a deeper understanding of the issues. You know, Clausewitz once said, you know, the great military strategist, that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And I think this is a very apt description and useful to understanding what's going on. The first thing I would say, in terms of what are the reasons for this war, I actually think it's better to start with the negative. What are not the reasons for this war? Because there's been a whole lot of talk from Netanyahu, from the United States, and so on. You know, they often say, you know, the first casualty of war is always the truth. You know, wars are always accompanied by a vast, you know, Niagara Falls worth of lies, always. You see this in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. And I have to say, as far as liars go, you'd be hard-pressed to find any bigger liar on this earth than Benjamin Netanyahu. So we have to look very, very carefully at what he's saying. What is he saying? He said that they've needed to go to war in order to stop Iran from developing a nuclear bomb. You know, this is something they've said. What are the facts here? What are the facts here? The fact is that every serious piece of intelligence has suggested that Iran has no interest at this time, or any time before that for that matter, in developing nuclear weapons. Every single serious piece of intelligence. That includes, by the way, the US's own intelligence. You had a report of the CIA back in March, which came to that conclusion, and I think another report just a few days ago. You had the International Atomic Energy Agency, which came out just a few days ago and said the same thing, that Iran has no interest at this time and has made no moves to develop nuclear weapons at this stage. The only source of that claim is Israel, the only one, and you won't find it anywhere else. This is quite telling. Netanyahu has been talking about Iran developing a nuclear bomb since I've been alive, which I'm 29 years old. So that's a very long period of time. By the way, he said the same thing about Iraq. You remember that? Before the invasion. He was the one pushing for, they've got weapons of mass destruction. Well, guess what? They didn't have weapons of mass destruction at all. It was a big lie. And he's lying again. No big surprise. Also, let's think about the hypocrisy here. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does. In fact, Israel is the only power in the region that has a massive cache of nuclear weapons. Of course, they don't admit to it publicly. Oh, and by the way, this whole complaint, they said, oh, well, Iran was withholding documents from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Israel doesn't even allow their inspectors into the country to inspect theirs. And yet they have the gall to accuse Iran of doing something which is its sovereign right, I would say, as a nation, to develop nuclear technology. It's just a stinking hypocrisy from beginning to end. Also, if they didn't have an argument for building a bomb before, they have a major incentive to develop the bomb now. Of course. And in fact, it's not just me saying that. That's actually the conclusion of the US's intelligence. I actually came across, I think it was today, an article in the New York Times, which is quoting a number of intelligence officials. And it says, senior US intelligence officials said that Iranian leaders were likely to shift toward producing a bomb if the American military attacked the Iranian uranium enrichment site at Fordow, or if Israel killed Iran's supreme leader. In other words, yeah, they'll develop a bomb if you attack them. This is the conclusion of U.S. intelligence. There you have it from the horse's mouth. Another argument, that Iran is the biggest supporter of terror in the Middle East. Oh, isn't that interesting claim? Now, let me be the first to say, we're not supporters of the Iranian regime. And yes, it's perfectly true that the Iranian regime has committed all kinds of atrocities, particularly against the Iranian working class. This is perfectly true. But let me also say, there's atrocities, and then there's atrocities. It wasn't Iran that killed 55,000 or more Palestinians in Gaza. Oh, and by the way, they want to talk about atomic bombs. You remember that minister in the Israeli government who said, you know, I know how we can deal with the problem in Gaza by dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza. You remember that? And then they say that the Iranians are reckless when it comes to, no, don't give me a break. Give me a break. This is ridiculous. Wasn't Iran that invaded Iraq in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands of people, leading to the creation of ISIS? It wasn't Iran that bombed Libya, and now you see the barbarism in that country. No, the greatest source of terror in the Middle East is Israel and the United States. In fact, you want to stop terror in the Middle East, you shouldn't be talking about regime change in Iran. You should be talking about regime change in Tel Aviv and in Washington if you truly want to stop terror in the Middle East. So no, give me a break that Iran is the main source of terror. This is ridiculous. They say they want to bring peace and democracy to Iran. Well, I remember they said, I don't know if you remember, they said something similar about Syria just a little while ago. You remember that? When Assad was in power, he's an ally of Iran. They said, he needs to go. We need peace and democracy. And now what do you have in Syria? You've got this figure, Jolani, who came out of a split from Al-Qaeda and who's now carrying out attacks on minorities, on Alawites, and so on inside of Syria. So yes, there's your peace and democracy now inside of Syria. This is what they've created. Also, just to say, if they want to take away support for the regime, what they're doing now will have the opposite effect inside Iran. In fact, what you're seeing happen in Iran at the moment is, in fact, a massive bolstering of support for the regime. And I don't think it's hard to see why. You know, if you want to win friends and influence people, usually, you know, you don't achieve that by dropping bombs on them, generally speaking. This is not how you do it. So you've seen a massive bolstering of support, of course, because people want to defend their country. How could they not? How could they not? In fact, I came across another interesting quote. This one is from a worker in Iran. This was quoted in the Financial Times, I think, from 2 days ago. And this is what she had to say. She's a private sector worker. She says, "I'm no fan of the Islamic Republic, but it's now time to show solidarity for Iran. Trump and Netanyahu say evacuate, as if they care about our health. How can a city of 10 million people evacuate? It's a good question. My husband and I are not going to pave the ground for them. Let them kill us." That's what she says. So this is, I think, gives you a taste of the mood that's being created in Iran at this stage. Now, what's really going on here? What's really going on here? The fact is, we have to look deeper to understand what's happening in the region. And I think we have to look at Israel and the US separately, because I'd say their interests are aligned in a way, but not completely. And I think there's some nuances there that we need to explore. I want to start with Israel, because I think with Israel it's a bit more clear-cut. And I would say with Israel there's two main reasons why Netanyahu provoked this war when he did. One of them is political. The other, you could say, is more strategic in nature. But starting with the political reasons, obviously Israel attacked Iran on June 13th. But the day before, on June 12th, it wasn't covered as widely in the media. His government almost collapsed. And I would add, it's not the first time that his government almost collapsed. I think it was a debate in the Israeli parliament over drafting of ultra-Orthodox Jews into the IDF, which almost led to the collapse of his government. I'm sure you all know Benjamin Netanyahu is a crook. He's accused with very serious charges of corruption inside of Israel, which he's immune from, effectively, as long as he remains in office. So in other words, the longer he remains in power, the longer he remains out of jail. You also have in Israel extremist elements that are propping up the government, figures like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, who are openly calling for genocide, war with Iran, and so on and so forth. He needs these elements on side, in order to essentially keep his government in power. And obviously they're in support of a war with Iran. I would also add that Benjamin Netanyahu, it's worth remembering, before this week, was massively unpopular inside of Israel. You would have seen these demos that have been happening over the past few months. Very low in the opinion polls. This war, though, is a very useful tool for him at this moment in time. Because what it effectively allows him to do is to use this war as a distraction, to manipulate public opinion, and to create this kind of rally around the flag effect inside of Israel, which I would say has been successful for the moment. You have, for example, the example of Benny Gantz, who you might remember. He was, I believe, the defense minister in Netanyahu's government. He resigned from the cabinet. But he came out the other day loudly supporting Netanyahu, supporting the war against Iran. And I believe the quote he gave was, listen, when it comes to this war, there's no left and right. There's only right and wrong. And we are right. This is what he said, this brave opposition politician. He's essentially fallen in line behind Netanyahu. I would say it's also had an effect on the public. I saw an opinion poll just today, which shows that Likud's level of support, Netanyahu's party, is now at the level that it was on October 7th. So it shot up, this rally around the flag effect. It has had an effect. Although I would say that this is a temporary phenomena. It always is. But nonetheless, it's had an effect. And it's effectively united a good part of the population behind Netanyahu for this moment. I'd also add that, actually no, I'll skip that, because running out for time. But yeah, I mentioned that there's also strategic reasons for this war. And not just with Netanyahu, but the entire Israeli ruling class. I would say that Israel, what it wants, what the Israeli ruling class wants, is to be the only significant economic and military power in the region. Iran is a major obstacle to that objective, because Iran is it's not a small country. It's a significant country with a population 10 times the size of Israel, with a rich history, centuries old, with a basis in industry, a strong working class, obviously a nuclear program as well. You do have the potential there for Iran to eventually emerge as a power in the region, which obviously Israel does not want. Also, on the question of nuclear weapons, like I said, Iran, all the evidence suggests they're not developing nuclear weapons at this stage. Although I will say, they do have high levels of uranium enrichment. In Iran, it's about 60%, which is well above the level that you would typically use for civilian nuclear energy. The term that's sometimes used is that Iran is a nuclear threshold state. The reason it maintains that is as a deterrent, effectively. Because Israel having nuclear weapons, what it allows Israel to do, doesn't probably intend to ever use them, hopefully. But it acts as an incredible way to kind of muscle your way around the Middle East. Because if anyone ever screws with you, you could say, well, listen, we have nuclear weapons, so do what we say. Iran having a significant level of uranium enrichment allows it to push back to a certain extent, which the Israeli ruling class is not happy about. So there's also, I would say, strategic reasons for knocking out Iran's nuclear enrichment program and, in fact, just reducing its strength as a power overall in the region to allow Israel to dominate the region. The problem with this, though, on the question of nuclear enrichment, Israel, all reports suggest, does not have the capability of destroying by force Iranians' nuclear enrichment by itself. You have a number of facilities all across the country, centrifuges, uranium, and so on. The most important of which is located in Fordo, which is, I believe, south of Tehran. It's a facility which is about half a mile deep underground. It's buried beneath a mountain. And there's only one weapon in the world, one conventional weapon in the world, that can take it out. It's the, I wrote the name down, the GBU-57, which is a 30,000 ton bomb. Sorry, 30,000 pound bomb. A bunker buster, I think is the term they use. It's actually so heavy that the only plane that can carry it is only one in the world, which is the B-2 bomber, because the thing is so damn heavy. The only country in the world that has either the B-2 bomber or this bunker buster bomb is the United States. And effectively, the United States is the only country with the real capability of taking out the Fordo facility, which helps to explain why Israel is doing everything in its power to drag the United States into this conflict, to effectively destroy the facility and to place Israel in an advantageous position. Now, that comes to the U.S. What is the position of the United States in this conflict? I think it's a bit more complicated than with Israel. First, I would say that the United States has played a reprehensible and reactionary role, not just in this current conflict, but in all the decades before. That if it weren't for the backing of the United States for Israel, it wouldn't have the license to act with the kind of impunity that it does in the Middle East. They do that because they've got their big brother behind them. They've got the U.S., they got Uncle Sam behind them. The U.S. supplies about 70% of Israel's weapons. They give them diplomatic support in the United Nations and other forums. They give them intelligence. They give them lots and lots of money, which, by the way, is the U.S. taxpayer who's paying for that. That's money that could be used for other things, but it's going to kill children in Gaza and Iran and so on and so forth. So the U.S. has played a reprehensible role. And this is why we say that the U.S. is still the most reactionary force on planet Earth today. And that will remain the case, I think, for a period. On the question of joining the war, though, I'm sure everyone has noticed it's been very erratic, Trump. The other day he issued an ultimatum to the Iranians, which was promptly rejected. Then he came back with, he called it an ultimate ultimatum, which I didn't know you could do that. This was also rejected. They asked him the other day if he's going to bomb Fordo. He said, I may do it, or I may not do it. It's a very, very confusing policy, to be honest. A lot of people, I think, I've heard them say, I wish I could get into this guy's head to see what the hell what's he thinking about? What's he considering? Although, to be honest, even if such a thing were possible, I don't think it would bring you any closer to the truth. Because he doesn't know what he's going to do. He doesn't know what's going on. I think, to be honest, he's found himself in a little bit of a pickle. I think it helps to ask, what in general is the United States trying to achieve in a general sense in terms of its foreign policy? I think, first of all, in terms of Iran, I think we can say the United States does want a deal with Iran. The reason why it wants a deal is primarily to pull Iran away from the influence of countries like China, countries like Russia. Just China, for example, has started doing a significant business with Iran in the last period. I think the figure is something like 50% of China's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously a key waterway adjacent to Iran. So there are important economic ties. There are important military ties with Russia. Obviously, Iran sends the attack drones, which Russia has used in the war, and so on and so forth. The United States would like to pull Iran away from that influence. It would also like to leave Iran weak, ideally, and maintain its alliance with Israel. That would mean not allowing Iran to have any nuclear enrichment whatsoever. And this is essentially where the United States has stayed in terms of its demands. I would also say that an additional focus of the United States is that as much as possible, they want to avoid long, protracted wars in certain regions, in particular Europe, in particular the Middle East, and focus as much as possible the bulk of their military assets in the Pacific, which would obviously be focused on China, which is the main strategic rival of the United States. These are the broad aims, you could say, of Trump. The problem right now with the situation is that these aims are effectively conflicting with one another. And it's also a problem, you could say, with Trump, that I think Trump had this idea that because he worked in real estate in New York City, that you could take that same approach to world politics and, get deals, right, with the Iranians, with whoever. That may work with some things. It seems like it's been somewhat effective with some of these trade deals. But it doesn't work with complicated questions like world politics, Israel, Palestine, Iran. That's where the real estate developer, I think, falls a bit short. And this has had an effect on the administration. What we've seen in the last week or so is major divisions opening within the administration and in the MAGA movement more generally. And effectively, what we can see are two distinct trends emerging within the movement. On the one hand, you have essentially the old Washington elite, if you like. Some people say, the neocons, these people who want to go to war with every single country all the time. You have figures like Lindsey Graham, for example, who's in the U.S. Senate. He's I think a apt representative, if you like, of this tendency. And this tendency is very enthusiastic about entering war with Iran, of going to war with Iran. The main reason for them is really questions of prestige from the standpoint of U.S. imperialism. That, in other words, Trump has gone too far, and if he backs down now, it's going to look incredibly weak and make the United States look incredibly weak. Whereas what they want to do is to project power on a world stage, to send a message to countries like China and so on and so forth that U.S. imperialism is still the big cop on the block. This is essentially the argument of this neocon wing. But on the other hand, you've had a new wing open up, which you could say is effectively an isolationist wing, if you like. And you have figures like Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, what's his name, Charlie Kirk, Tulsi Gabbard, who's actually the head of the CIA at the moment, and other figures who have emerged, who have argued from a very different point of view. Obviously still in the interests of United States capitalism, but their perspective has been one of, we don't want to get tied down in the Middle East. We need to focus our efforts on the domestic front and also focus it on China. So you also have some noise coming out from this wing as well. I think Tucker Carlson has probably been the most interesting. I don't know if people remember watching Tucker Carlson a few years ago. His views have, obviously, still a Trump supporter, still a reactionary, but his views have evolved on Russia and on this question. I don't know if anyone's seen this now viral interview that he's done with Ted Cruz, where they debate a number of questions, including Ted Cruz's support for regime change in Iran. I didn't watch the whole thing. It's very amusing. I'd encourage you to watch it. It's very, very interesting. He calls him a neocon to his face, and so on and so forth. It's very, very interesting. I never thought I'd be cheering for Tucker Carlson, but I was in a weird position where I was like, yeah, he's right on this point. He's right on that point. But it's a very interesting development. But what we can say about these two wings is that, in a way, they're both right, and in a way, they're both wrong in terms of defending the long-term interests of U.S. imperialism. The problem is that U.S. imperialism in Trump is effectively in an impossible situation at this moment in time. You also have serious divisions within Trump's supporters, and I think this is maybe even more important. Think about it. Trump, on the campaign, promised an end to forever wars. He promised America first. He promised a massive reduction to the cost of living. This is not going to happen. And actually, this war, if the United States enters, will have a massive effect on driving up the cost of living in the United States, driving up inflation. Something like, again, I mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, something like a third of seabound oil passes through that strait. But Iran has said, if the United States enters the war, they'll mine the Strait of Hormuz, and not a single tanker will pass through it. What effect is that going to have on inflation? What effect is that going to have on gas prices? Not a good one. And this is going to have an effect on Trump's supporters at a certain stage. Now, it's hard to predict what Trump will do next. I think, I'm not a gambling man, so I'm not going to say what he's going to do next because, like I said, I don't think he knows what he's going to do next. Although I will say that there's a few scenarios which are possible. I say one scenario is that Iran makes major concessions over the next 2 weeks, which Trump then presents as an immense victory, which he attained. Although I would say that this outcome would be very, very difficult for the Iranian regime to make, because no nuclear enrichment whatsoever, which is what the Americans are demanding, would be suicide for Iran. Because essentially the only deterrent that they have against Israel would be gone. And also, the Iranian regime, they say they're crazy maniacs. No, in fact, they're very intelligent. They're very intelligent, absolutely. They know this won't be the end. Once Israel gets rid of the nuclear enrichment, they're going to go after other things. They're going to go after the ballistic missiles probably next. Because Israel doesn't feel safe. So we need to get rid of the ballistic missiles. And then it will be something else. There'll be no end to it. And the Iranian regime is fully aware. So this creates some difficulties on this front. I think another scenario is that Trump does carry out an attack on Fordo, tries to destroy the facility, and then, and then effectively tries to, got some turkey bacon club stuck. Hey, don't eat at Tim Hortons. Thank you. What was I saying? The second scenario, that Trump does make a strike on Fordo, tries to destroy the facility, but then essentially stops there and tries not to allow the war to deepen further. I think there is some precedent here. I think insofar as Trump has a foreign policy doctrine, you can say his approach has been, hitting hard and fast and then pulling back. This he's done a few times now. You saw this with the assassination of Soleimani, where again it was an incredibly provocative attack by the United States, but then they withdrew. You also saw this with the bombing of Syria, which I believe was in 2017, when they fired a number of missiles into Syria. Again, a very fierce attack, and then a withdrawal. But there's also a few problems with this. I think the first problem is that bombing Fordo is not a guarantee of its destruction, that this is an incredibly reinforced facility. I was actually reading one article that says it would take more than one of these bombs. And not only that, but they would have to hit in the exact same area multiple times in order to effectively destroy the facility. So this is not guaranteed. Also, it's not the only location of Iran's nuclear enrichment, of its uranium. It's spread across the country, some of which are in secret locations, which they don't know the location of. And they also have the know-how. Yes, they killed all of these nuclear scientists, but the knowledge is there amongst Iran's intellectual class. And even if they destroy every last piece of the nuclear enrichment program, it can be rebuilt in time. So even this is not a guarantee. And it runs the risk of deepening this conflict. Because if the United States gets involved in a serious way, then there is a serious risk of retaliation by Iran against U.S. military assets. And Iran, let me say this, it's not Hamas, and it's not Hezbollah. It's a large nation with an advanced military apparatus, with a large cache of ballistic missiles, and in close proximity, I would add, to a large number of U.S. military assets and bases in the region. Bases in Qatar, UAE, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth, all of which Iran can hit, and quite effectively. This is the prospect for the United States. Essentially, the United States has a situation where they're damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't, which I think explains to a certain degree the paralysis and the kind of erratic nature of Trump in the last period. He doesn't know which way to move. And this is going to have, in any case scenario, a profound impact on the region, a profound impact on ordinary people, and in particular on the people of Iran, however this situation plays out. But just to conclude, obviously there's much more we can say. I just want to end on the effect that this will have on consciousness, because I think this is an important element which can't be ignored. Obviously, it's going to have a massive impact on consciousness throughout the Middle East, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and so on and so forth. But I would also add, and we shouldn't forget, that this war will also, at a certain stage, have an effect on consciousness inside of the United States. And this is very important. Every poll I've seen shows that a clear majority of Americans are opposed to this war, whether they're Democrats or whether they're Republicans. In fact, I saw a very interesting poll just about a few days ago, which shows that probably for the first time ever, over 50% of Republicans under the age of 50 do not support Israel, which that's probably the first time that's ever happened in American history. This is a very, very profound shift in the situation. These are probably the Tucker Carlson kids who have taken this view, to be honest. I think it's honestly symptomatic of a deeper process that's taking place in the American working class. Why did these people vote for Trump? They voted for Trump, again, for an end to the forever wars, for America first, to a massive increase in wages, a massive increase to the cost of living, a massive reduction in inflation, and so on and so forth. They didn't vote for a war with Iran. And I think there's going to be a significant layer within the United States that's going to see this as a massive betrayal. I think, this is how Tucker Carlson probably feels. He honestly seems a bit disappointed when you listen to him. He genuinely really liked Trump. And you can tell, it's almost, you can almost see the sadness in his eye. But I think this is maybe a feeling that many Americans are feeling at the moment. I would also add that this process also extends to Canada, although in a different way. Many people voted for Mark Carney in the last election. Many people thought he was the lesser evil, that he was the better option than Pierre Poilievre. He even made some positive steps. In fact, it was totally performative. But on Israel, you saw this statement they issued with, I believe it was Britain and France, where they offered some mild criticism of Israel. Of course, they didn't do absolutely anything to actually change their support for Israel. But nonetheless, they issued a very nice statement. They actually sanctioned two of the ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. This was, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But now look at the situation. I think people will realize that everything that Carney said, all of these statements and half-hearted measures, was all just a load of crap. It was all just a bunch of hot air. And fundamentally, Carney represents the exact same thing that Trudeau did before him and Harper did before him. In other words, they all carry out this policy, which is defending the interests of Canadian imperialism at any cost whatsoever. This is going to create a massive mood of anger in the next period, especially amongst the youth. And you can already feel it. I don't know, going out to some of these protests, there's going to be a big one on Sunday, which I hope you can all make it out to. But you can feel the anger at these people who are literally, dragging the world into a bloodbath in order to stay in power. How else can you describe it? Netanyahu is willing to shed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people so he can stay out of prison. This is what this war is about. You know, this is, yeah, if you want to talk about insanity, of course, it's not quite insanity, but it's barbarism. This is what these politicians represent. And this is what young people, working people will see. And this will massively generate an incredible anger in the next period. And what I would say is that it's our role as Marxists to connect with this anger, to offer an explanation for why things are the way they are, for where things are going, and to organize those people for the fight to overthrow imperialism at home. Because that's what you can do to support the people of Iran and the people of the world, is to fight imperialism at home. Because the fact is, when we look at the question of war, again, war is not random. War is not just the product of evil people. War is a definite product of this socioeconomic system. It is a product of capitalism. And as long as you have capitalism, you will have imperialism and you will have war. You know, the conquest of new markets, the control of resources, the control of labor, and so on and so forth. This is what capitalism means. And until you bring the system to an end, we'll never see an end to these sorts of things. And just think about it in terms of fighting imperialism at home. Imagine a successful workers' revolution in the United States, in the heart of world imperialism. Imagine the effect that would have on the world situation. First of all, the first thing that would happen is that the Zionist regime would immediately lose its basis of support. It's nothing without the United States. It would become like a paper tiger without them. And not just the Zionist regime, but the Saudi regime and many other regimes that could not stand without the power of the United States. But more importantly, a successful revolution in the United States would immediately spread to almost every country in the world. You know, we have the example of the Russian Revolution, 1917. The effect of that revolution was to spread in country after country. In Germany, in Hungary, significant movements of the workers in France, in Britain. That was the effect of a successful revolution in Russia. A successful revolution in the United States would have an even more tremendous effect. And that would be the end of capitalism. Now, of course, that's a long-term perspective. But I would say that it's the only perspective for how to end war at the end of the day, which is to prepare and to organize for revolution. So that is what we do. That's why we put on these events. And I would implore you, if you agree with that, and you want to bring an end to this system, bring an end to war, to join us and help us to build this party. So I'll leave the introduction there.
Thank you, Marco. Yeah, there's a lot in there that we can dive deeper into. So I want to encourage people to raise your hand. I can put you on the list, and we can go